There was a color revolution in Ukraine 2004, which partially smashed the Ukrainian polity, and now there was an attempt to have yet another color revolution, this time using not the Golden Youth, who had been chewed up the previous time, but now fascists, right? Neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, this fascist cult in Lvov or Lviv or Lemberg, Leopold in French, right? This awful town in the far west of Ukraine, which is the center of this, again, revanchist thinking, right? Hatred of Russia, hatred of the Soviet Union, nostalgia for Hitler. And at a certain point, by pushing that forward, right, the crisis in Ukraine becomes a challenge to Russia when the U.S. and NATO insist on staging this coup on the 21st of February of this year and installing a fascist government. There's no other way to put it, right? Svoboda is fascist, the right sector, Pravi sector, fascist, and the business-suited characters, right, like Yatsenyuk and so forth, they're fascist too in their own way, because what they're coming in with is the International Monetary Fund austerity program, which calls for what? The looting of the Black Earth region of Ukrainian agriculture. It calls for the transfer of the Ukrainian pipeline system to a company like Chevron for essentially nothing, for doubling the price of natural gas, for essentially destroying the social safety net for children, for pregnant women, for old people, for the sick, right? All of that is going to be swept away.
Just amazing.
So the typical IMF shock therapy, and naturally a huge backlash against that. And when the Russophobic, fascistic tendencies of this Kiev fascist clique became clear in February and March, and naturally an armed resistance developed in the eastern part of the country. So you can see it's out of the desperate measures to save the empire are the ones that are generating these clashes. And what Putin's doing, I think, is simply defensive. This is not an offensive plan in any sense. He's simply attempting to prevent this lunatic policy of driving the NATO sphere right up to the Russian border, which there had been pledges made in the early 1990s, which I can recall very well, that NATO would not even move into East Germany, the former DDR. No NATO in the eastern part of Germany, and by implication, no place further east than that. But then instead, we've got to have Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, right? Canadians may be surprised to know that they are pledged to fight and die for cliques of Russophobic hotheads and neo-fascists in those Baltic states. Same thing ultimately for Poland with somebody like Sikorsky. And there's even an attempt then to include Georgia under this Saakashvili, who was he's not in power anymore, but this was certainly a fascist who himself attacked Russia, right? Mm-hmm. Talk about lunacy. That's what he did in August of 2008. So that's what we're living through right now. So there's a great similarity between the Sarajevo period and, what can we call it, the Torres period. Torres, I guess, is the biggest town close to the crash site of this airplane.
And that's something that I was gonna mention, just in terms of what you said about the defensive position of Russia. It's really interesting. I'll just bring this up, maybe if you want to touch on it. One of my former guests on the show, he's a student actually for the University of Manitoba. He was speaking about Russia, geopolitics, etc., and he talked about how it was really interesting to him how quickly violence erupted right after the Olympics in Russia. And he said that this was an example of why the defensive theory was more appropriate, because after spending billions to improve your PR campaign, billions of dollars, to then be drawn into that conflict, it just didn't make sense. It wasn't logical. And I thought that was very interesting, because it seems like they were almost, what's the word I'm looking for here? They were brought in, as opposed to having the initial intent to strike first. And that was an interesting opportunity I saw from a propaganda standpoint to kind of discredit and to demonize the Russians a bit further. Also, in regards to, you just mentioned the Malaysian flight that was downed. Previously, the same guest had made a comparison, or hadn't made the comparison. I'm drawing the comparison, but had mentioned that in the news had been reporting that surface-to-air missiles had been stolen, and he was under the notion, he had actually made a bold statement and said that he believed that it was possible for the Russians to use those to blame on the Ukrainians, the anti-separatists, and to use that as a pretext for further invasion. And now we're in this situation where we can actually see the opposite is taking place. But I just wanted to mention that in the previous episode.
Yeah, look, on that, if you want to use the good old cui bono, cui prodest argument, it's pretty obvious that no benefit has accrued
absolutely
to any Ukrainian separatist or to Putin from this hysteria, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And to begin with, we have to say, isn't it strange that 300 people on this plane, in the eyes of the controlled NATO media, are worth far more than 1,100 Palestinians who have been killed? They seem to count for nothing. There's no tears for them, no funeral broadcasts on CNN with chauvinistic rhetoric from Wolf Blitzer or
absolutely.
From Anderson Cooper or from this Richard Quest, who I think probably should be under the care of a psychiatrist at this point. But let's just take off some of the things with this incident, right? Obviously, gross negligence to fly over a war zone. This is crazy. You shouldn't do it, right? So, as we once had a debate here in the United States during World War I, should you send merchant ships into the war zones of the combatants of World War I? And one senator said, "Look, if you insist on walking through a brawl, you're going to get punched." So that, I think, would have been good advice for the people running aircraft, right? Because it would have removed the possibility for anybody to hit this plane. But
absolutely,
remember, all the weapons that Russia has, at least the ones of a certain age, Ukraine has too. So these Buk batteries, whatever they are, SAM-11s, surface-to-air missiles, everybody in the Ukrainian military who has to do with these air defense questions is perfectly capable of running a Buk battery. So you would have to show that the Ukrainian Buk batteries were not involved, and they could very well have been involved. Then you have the other story coming from Russia, which is that there were fighter aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force in the immediate area. So there's no guarantee that it's a surface-to-air missile. It could have been an air-to-air missile, would have done exactly the same job. And then we have this interesting question, Operation Sea Breeze 2014. Traditionally, there's been a summer exercise by the NATO navies in the Black Sea, and in recent years, this has involved Ukrainian ports, Odessa in particular. And I can remember a couple of years ago, during the Iraq War, at the high points of it, there were large demonstrations by Ukrainian citizens telling the NATO warships to get out of those ports. Well, this year we haven't had Operation Sea Breeze 2014, but according to Wayne Madsen, who gets his sources, he's told things from the NSA and other sources, what we have had is Operation Breeze 2014, and this has included ships from quite a number of NATO navies. Canada is not on my list, but what we have is Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, United Kingdom, Greece, Spain, Italy, France, U.S. And they've been in the Black Sea. The U.S. contingent is led by the Aegis cruiser, the Vela Gulf, USS Vela Gulf, which has this Aegis radar, which can look far into the interior of the Ukraine, and they've also got AWACS aircraft, right? High-flying surveillance aircraft that can look for hundreds of miles over the horizon. And what given the fact that these large operations are typically done by making drills go live, right? Taking drills and flipping them live. This is the thesis of my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA. I hope people will read that book. especially the fifth edition. If you don't have the fifth edition, you've cheated yourself of some of the most important things. And I'm up to about 45 drills, exercises, and other events that are associated with 9/11 that essentially prepared and executed every aspect, all the principal features, the memes and the components of 9/11, all related to, created by, prepared by these drills. So now when we look at Ukraine, we find a somewhat murky drill, right, going from sea breeze to breeze, but with plenty of Aegis and plenty of AWACS that would have been necessary to, or would have been highly useful at least in arranging and executing what we've seen. So I would not believe any of this stuff. There is, of course, a conflict inside the U.S. Intelligence about this, right? Because Tuesday of last week, you had unnamed high intelligence officials, and I don't know who they are because this is the so-called off-the-record stuff, right? The ground rules of the briefing are you can't say who's talking. But who could it have been? Brennan of the CIA? I honestly don't know. But their word is the United States has no proof that would indicate a direct role of Russia in this.
Absolutely, yeah.
So at least that much. And then beyond that, what proof do you have that these much maligned and much demonized pro-Russian separatist or federalist forces, whatever you want to call them, in Donetsk, Lugansk, how can you say that they're responsible based, again, on no proof? You can't start World War III based on social media, can you? Because of somebody putting some picture of something on Twitter or Facebook. And even those, right? The picture of the Buk launcher with one rocket missing, traveling, off the screen. Mm-hmm. The Russians have put up that, if you look at the street signs and so forth, you'll find that this is not at all where it was accused of being. Mm-hmm. But principally that there is a faction in the CIA that says, look, you have no proof here, and it's better to not to insist too much on something where the basis of it is so sketchy. Becomes a challenge to Russia when the U.S. and NATO insist on staging this coup on the 21st of February of this year and installing a fascist government. There's no other way to put it, right? Svoboda is fascist, but now fascists, right? Neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, this fascist cult in Lvov or Lviv or Lemberg, Léopold in French, right? This awful town in the far west of Ukraine. There was a color revolution in Ukraine 2004, which partially smashed the Ukrainian polity, and now there was an attempt to have yet another color revolution, this time using not the Golden Youth, who had been chewed up the previous time, which is the center of this, again, revanchist thinking, right? Hatred of Russia, hatred of the Soviet Union, nostalgia for Hitler. And at a certain point, by pushing that forward, right, the crisis in Ukraine, the right sector, Pravy sector, fascist, and the business-suited characters, right, like Yatsenyuk and so forth, they're fascist too in their own way, because what they're coming in with is the international